Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Faculty and staff, as well as students. Very pleased to have you all this morning. This is our third talk of the morning. I've been involved in most of the talks that we've had and thoroughly have enjoyed them. We don't have a talk immediately following this presentation. I think our next talk is not until 2 p.m., where we're considering narrative and reality at that time. So I invite you to join us back at that point. Prior to introducing our speaker this morning, I've been engaging in a little cognitive processing. I may have some pseudo memories sort of mixed in there in some respects. I know that I've had Dr. Jeanis learning how to pronounce names. I know that's something that Dr. C and Dr. P and I have tried to gather from our speakers prior to. Most of us know our speaker today. I have been around for a long time, so I didn't know whether or not I had her, maybe back in the day in first grade or 12th grade or here in college. We've kind of conversed a little bit. So she worked, at least served as a GA for a short period of time early on in her program. She's someone that, you get the feeling of knowing instantly when you talk to, interact with her. I actually contacted Dr. Perkins on yesterday. Should I trust his memory? We're talking fake news and all this other good stuff. I'm not sure, but I did get a little bit of information that I didn't know. Of course, I knew Dr. Jeanis, person like I said. She got her degree from our program, her master's degree from this program, and she developed a keen passion for criminal justice. She obtained her PhD from the University of South Florida. Strong commitment to science and to the disenfranchised. And quoting Dr. Perkins directly, an all-around awesome person. Amen, amen, amen. I concur. So Dr. Jeanis will be speaking on media, victim worthiness, and missing persons. Certainly a pleasure to have you with us today. Please take it over.
Thank you so much. Oh, what a warm introduction. I love Psychology Day. I love being invited to talk, and I always have so much to say on these topics, especially when we're talking about missing persons in the media. That is predominantly where my research is focused. I also do some runaway youth research as well. But really for me, what brings it home is how we talk about people when they go missing in the news. So I'm going to give you guys an overview of basically just the issue, some of the theoretical underpinnings that we think cause these issues, and then a little bit on some of the research that I've worked on. So I'm going to share my screen and get started. All right. Okay, so basically when we're talking about crime in the news, it follows the if it bleeds, it leads perspective. So what that means is that usually sensational stories, particularly gory stories, stories involving violence, receive more news attention generally. So what we're talking about here is coverage based on what has historically been profitable. So when we're talking about news outlets, a lot of people think like the goal of that news outlet is to accurately portray the crime issue. But really the goal of that news outlet is to make money, right? To talk about stories that can bring in viewers that can get that money. So they create or they pick news stories to cover and create that story based on what has historically been profitable. So typically crime in the news functions under a newsworthiness paradigm. There are 12 dominant newsworthiness characteristics. So if you have a crime story that features these newsworthiness characteristics, they're likely to receive news attention in traditional news media outlets. So for example, the case has to be interesting enough for people to care about it. So even though property crime is far more common in America than violent crime is far more likely to be covered in the news because it's more interesting, it's more captivating. Cases that involve, sex, celebrities, lots of violence, cases that have video imagery, like a video footage of a kidnapping out in the streets with CCTV. Those cases are typically really newsworthy. Why? Because we can vicariously participate in that, and we're likely to tune back in. So that's just at default what news looks like. What crime looks like in the news. When we're talking about missing persons, that translates typically to this, right? The majority of the missing persons cases that the average person hears about is the young white woman, typically. Just to give you a little bit of information about the missing persons problem before I dive too deep into disparity in coverage. The recent statistics tell us that there are about 89,000 active missing persons cases. So what that means is they have remained active after that initial input in the system on NamUs and NCIC. So these are still missing cases that aren't resolved very quickly. But we get a lot of missing persons cases inputted every year. So about 650,000 cases every year, but the majority of them are cleared because the majority of those cases are runaway youth who are recovered very quickly, usually within a few days. Now, that doesn't say that those runaway youths aren't at risk. They absolutely are, but they're usually cleared really quickly in the system. If we're looking at just Louisiana, we have 448 active cases right now on NamUs. There's probably more than that. We don't have a really strong data collection system for missing persons, especially adults who go missing. So these are only really rough estimates because not all agencies report to our national clearinghouses. So for example, it's not required for police agencies in Louisiana to put a missing persons case on NamUs, which is our national repository of missing and unidentified remains. So if they don't have to do it, they often don't. And so we don't know that those individuals are missing because they're not in our national records. Anyway, our long-term missing persons cases are considered high risk because, for one, it's really hard to disappear these days, right? So usually when someone is missing for a long period of time, their recovery is not a positive one where they're recovered alive. Usually they're recovered deceased. And about half of those active missing persons cases are adults that remain missing. I have a few here. These are some of our Louisiana cases because I'm always trying to get, I'm trying to get some awareness out there. So I just wanted to give you an idea, but there you can look on NamUs and look up any of those cases. So it's a pretty big problem is the gist of it, right? We have a lot of people going missing. We have a lot of people presumed to be in danger. We have a lot of criminal cases that remain open, that become cold cases. And we tend to talk about them a lot in the news. And we think that the news is really important for missing persons cases. And that's what tends to separate this type of crime from other types of crime. It has a unique relationship with news media. We think that it is integral to the recovery of a missing persons case to receive attention, right? Police tell us that instead of 2 eyes, we have hundreds of eyes out there looking for these people, spreading the word, perhaps, soliciting some information from people that they know. We need the media to help bring these people home safe. So that's why it's so important that we consider the impact or the relationship that missing persons cases have with the media. And what we see is a whole lot of disparity in media coverage for missing persons cases. And I'm going to go through the 4 dominant factors. There are more, but they are harder to research. So there's not a lot of literature on them. I'm happy to talk about more if anybody has any questions, but I'm going to focus on the big four. So basically what we see is that the majority of individuals who go missing and end up in the news are white individuals. So news outlets are far more likely to cover missing white individuals than they are any other race. Actually, there's very little research on any race beyond white, non-white, in part because missing persons is so understudied. So really when I'm talking about race and ethnicity, unfortunately, I'm just talking about the dichotomy of white, non-white. But predominantly white cases are featured. And we see this at increasing levels of attention. So at the local level, white individuals who go missing get more news coverage at the state level, at the out-of-state level, and at the national level. So it's all the way up the chain. So the big question is why? Why do white individuals get more attention when they go missing? We think that part of it is exposure to traditionally biased media outlets. So again, what has historically been profitable will be used today and featured in the news. Well, our news outlets are predominantly owned by rich white men who make decisions about what's important and what types of cases should be covered. And so what we have seen at the local level and at the national level, when we study it and we compare what is shown in the news on racial differences in crime and the actual statistics, they don't always match up. So what that means is that news outlets are more likely to feature crime involving Black individuals as perpetrators and white individuals as victims. So historically, the average individual has been exposed to that dichotomy over and over again. The Black person as the offender, the white person as the victim. And so people start to think that that's how crime is, that Black people are likely to be offenders, white people are likely to be victims. And so when they see a white person who goes missing, that's consistent with their perceptions of the world, right? When we have a Black person who goes missing, that might not be consistent with our perceptions of victimness based on what we've experienced. Also, belief systems about race can shape engagement. If you have biased belief systems about races, a particular race, then you're not going to engage with them as much, right? You're not going to tune in that way. So what we think it is that it's both the individual and the media conglomerates that have layers of bias due to longstanding bias practices in our nation that influence this predominantly white missing persons, or what we call missing white woman syndrome. And that brings us to gender. Women receive far more coverage when they go missing, again, at all levels. So local to national, women are far more likely to be featured when they go missing than men. Why is that occurring? We think in part because of our perceptions about women as victims of crime, right? Our statistics suggest that women experience victimization in certain aspects more than men. And in part, we think it's because men are less likely to report when they're victimized in certain ways, right? And we're more likely to believe that women need to be taken care of, that the world is more dangerous for them, so we need to protect our women. We practice paternalism in our society, in a patriarchal society. This belief that we have to protect our women because they're too fragile to live out in the world themselves. So what that means is when they go missing, we're more likely to believe that they're in danger, and so we're more likely to cover their cases. And that the flip side of that is biased belief systems about men's risk for victimization. So even though young Black men are the most likely individuals to be murdered, we don't think about men or men of color as victims of crime. Particularly around here, we may be more likely to think that men are strong and capable due to just sort of chivalry of being so common around here in the South. So we might be more likely to think that men can take care of themselves out in the world. And so when they go missing, we think they voluntarily left as opposed to something dangerous or harmful happened to them. The next type of disparity in coverage is age. So children receive significantly more coverage when they go missing than adults. Elders boomers, so individuals 65 or older, some research suggests that they receive more attention than other adult categories, but I'm going to talk about that more with my research. And we still tend to see gender differences even with age. So even though we we create sort of a hierarchy of victimization and say that like children are higher in the hierarchy. Why? Because when children go missing, the world is inherently dangerous for them, right? Unlike adults, adults can legally and voluntarily disappear. You could get up and walk out of your life today, and that is not illegal. So what that means for law enforcement is that unless it looks like a crime has occurred, then they don't think a crime has occurred. So that really complicates adult missing persons cases and can be one of the reasons why we're more likely to cover a child when they go missing, right? Because inherently danger is out there for them. So we need to protect our children. However, we tend to see that that perception of men and boys not being as vulnerable is reflective in our disparity in coverage for children as well. We believe that girls are more likely to get coverage than boys, again, because we think boys are less likely to be victimized out in the world. That may or may not be true, but they're still being victimized. The last aspect in disparity of coverage that I want to talk about is case circumstances. So I said kids get more attention, well, except for runaway kiddos. Runaway youth receive less coverage than other children by and large in most studies, sometimes even less coverage than adults. So when we have runaway kiddos, we're far less likely to talk about them in the news. And another aspect of case circumstance is stranger kidnappings. If cases look like a typical stranger kidnapping, or we have evidence that it's a typical stranger kidnapping, those cases are really popular. They get a whole lot of coverage. Why? Well, it sort of feeds into our historical traumas, those high profile cases that we've heard about, right? Many of us are familiar, even if we weren't even born in that time frame, with how high profile missing persons cases were in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, right? Think of Adam Walsh and those types of really popular typical stranger kidnappings of the time. We're reminded of those and how dangerous the world was in that time frame. And so when we hear about a typical stranger kidnapping case today, it brings up all of those previous thoughts and feelings about that time. The news tends to bring up those cases too, right? They want to remind you of those traumatic events so they can solicit some fear in you. So you tune in, right? Because if you're scared, then you're going to want to watch again to know how to protect yourself or your kiddos, or just get more information about what's going on. So when we have those types of cases, they're just hugely popular. And our runaway kiddos, unfortunately, even though they're really high risk, right? We've learned the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children tells us that approximately 1 in 6 runaway kiddos are being sexually exploited out there, so human trafficked. So this is a really dangerous environment for those children. But these preconceived notions about risk and dangerousness, they shape how likely our news outlets are to cover these runaway children. So for example, we tend to think that runaway kids are incorrigible. They just don't want to listen to mom and dad. Maybe they're running away to go party or have premarital sex or those types of things. So when we have those preconceived notions about runaways, we're not paying attention. They're not getting on the news. Nobody's talking about them. There's not this pull or this push in the public to care about these kids. Even though that's not the case today, right? Or that was never the case. We know that runaways are running typically from trauma, abuse, and family dysfunction. And when they're on the streets, they're being victimized or they're participating in crime as a means to survive. Because they can't get jobs or make money. So they're selling their bodies or they're selling drugs or they're stealing. So it's really a dangerous time for these kids, but those belief systems remain intact, and we see that bias in traditional news outlets. Now moving into the social media realm. So what about social media, right? It's supposed to be the game changer. At least that's what it said to be, right? We talked about it being the great equalizer. that there would be the power of the collective individual as opposed to these big media conglomerates owned by old white men telling us what to care about. Now we have the individual who can click, click, click and create this, crowdsource this attention, right? We're calling it the new milk carton campaign of today. So if this was probably before most of you guys' time, but it was a grassroots effort when some children were going missing in and around the early 80s. It started like milk companies, dairies decided to start featuring some missing kids in the community, particularly Johnny Gosh, who was a paper boy who was kidnapped and who has still never been found today. So really high profile cases of the time, stereotypical stranger kidnappings. We started featuring them on milk cartons. The thought was that we would spread awareness out there, that people would be looking for these kiddos. Great idea, right? Well, what we ended up doing was just like putting these scary milk cartons in front of other children and scaring them a lot because they thought that they would be kidnapped. And it wasn't really raising the awareness to the adults like we wanted it to. But it still was like hugely popular. And at the time they said that it increased tips by 30% the following year. So there is some evidence to say that it at least solicited tips. So anyway, we're saying social media is this milk carton campaign of today, right? It's going to change everything. It's going to get rid of all this disparity. It's going to bring all these kiddos home. It's going to be this great thing that saves all of us. At least that was the idea. So then I started to question, well, what does it look like in the social media realm, right? Does this disparity that we see in traditional media outlets still exist in social media when we're supposed to have the power of the people? Well, unfortunately, we didn't exactly see it function in the ways that we wanted it to. So the first data I want to talk about is the new milk carton campaign study, which I shamelessly stole that title. But what we looked at was the Find Mickey Shunick Now nonprofit Facebook group, which is organized by RAMP, Research Association for Missing People. So that's a nonprofit organization that's trying to raise awareness about local cases of missing individuals. So we partnered with them and we did a big old data collection of the missing persons posts to get an idea of how people are interacting with missing persons cases when they're in the social media realm. What you see here is an example of an average post and some of the engagement factors that we looked at. So what you see here are the initial results. We organized exposure by minimal, moderate, and maximum engagement. So minimum engagement is a click. Moderate engagement is a like or a reaction, and maximum engagement is a share. Reach is it's supposed to be unique individual users reached, and then we wanted to see what was shaping those hide post behaviors as well. So when we looked at the characteristics of the missing persons posts, we saw that some stuff was similar, right? We saw more attention for younger adults or children, totally consistent with what the literature tells us. What we didn't see were any gender differences. No significant differences by gender, which was surprising for us. And one thing that we want to look at is if that's unique to the location, because it's a national organization, but based in Louisiana, far more Louisiana engagement. So could this be a product of just like Louisiana and the hunting culture, which can be dangerous for men out there, right? Lots of men go disappear while hunting out in the woods. So we don't know if it's just because the context is different here, or if perhaps those gender differences are not as powerful in the social media realm. But what we did see was that race was still significantly related to engagement, where white individuals who went missing received significantly more engagement at all levels. We also saw that we saw less engagement with runaways, which is what we expected, but we wanted to explore some things a little bit further. So what you see here is moderate engagement by race and age. And you can see that as when we're talking about kiddos, so as that age decreases, we get more engagement. And you also see significantly more engagement by race, even when we're accounting for age. So that race variable still seems really important in shaping how users engage. We also looked at race and runaway status, and we saw similarly the same relationships where individuals who were deemed runaways were less likely to be engaged with, and individuals who were white were more likely to be engaged with even when they were runaways. So what that tells us is that disparity still exists in the social media realm. However, this is just one study in one place, and definitely needs to be replicated to see, is this, more of a Southern issue, a Louisiana issue, or is this really how we function in the social media realm? Another thing that we looked at was monetizing of those missing persons posts. So one thing that we think shapes engagement and exposure is status or money, right? If the family is very wealthy, then they can afford to have increased exposure. They can have billboards, they can take out commercials, they can pay for searches and helicopters and all of that kind of stuff. However, it's really hard to measure income level of an individual. I'm not going to call the families and ask them how much they make if they have a missing kiddo. So it's hard to get that kind of information or to disentangle that status and income from the rest of what's going on in this. So we wanted to look at what happens when we can throw some money at the problem, right? When we can use that boost post feature on Facebook to solicit more engagement. And what we did was we created matched pairs of cases, and that's what you see an example of. We created the traditional flyers that looked like an average missing persons flyer. We used Name Us to get our cases, and then we matched people on those characteristics that might shape engagement, like race, gender, geographical location, and case circumstance. And what we saw that when we created these matched pairs, we boosted one and not the other. The boost feature significantly increased exposure. And that's what you see in the table, the non-boosted posts versus the boosted posts. So non-boosted posts received far less engagement at all levels than our boosted posts. However, when we explored this further by those specific characteristics like race, we saw that what was really happening was our boosting of those posts, so putting money to increase engagement, really only worked for our cases involving minority victims. Because those white victims already had so much engagement, when we boosted them, we didn't see a significant difference. However, when we boosted those individuals of color, we saw big differences in engagement. So what that tells us is that that boost feature can be beneficial, and it also highlights the level of bias that is still remains in the social media realm. And we were hoping that this would help practitioners, law enforcement, nonprofit organizations, families get a better understanding, because they're operating in the social media realm right now, trying to raise awareness for their cases. So we wanted to give them some information on some tools that could help that exposure. The last thing that I want to talk about is everything else I'm working on. What we have going on is what we call the Big Missing Persons Project. And I got a little example of it. This is our data collection spreadsheet for each article. So what we're doing is we have a national sample missing persons cases. We have over 3,000, 4,000. And we are looking at national media attention. We want to know, when we're accounting for geographical regions and all of those levels of bias that can exist, how are we talking about our missing people? Another thing that we're doing is looking at solvability and media attention. So like I said before, we think solvability and media attention are directly related. and strongly related. However, no one has empirically proven this. So that's one of the primary goals of my research, is to see how much that media attention matters in recovering that victim. And also not just traditional media, but social media. What happens when we're using both of them at the same time? Is that increasing our likelihood that we bring that person home? So that is a huge study that we're undertaking to better understand this relationship. Also, cold cases and forensic genetic genealogy is a big passion of mine right now. Looking at those older missing persons cases, can we use forensic genetic genealogy today to identify those individuals, to understand what happened, to get a better idea of who our offenders are? One thing that I also wanted to talk about is Indigenous persons. So we know that there's a huge problem in the United States right now. We have no idea how many Indigenous persons are missing. We have largely excluded them from all of our national statistics, partly because our tribal nations have very, very little support and no direct linking with our federal government in the sharing of that sort of information. So basically, they've been working with very limited resources and no external help. And they have a lot of missing and murdered women, particularly, but also men and children in our tribal nations. We know that people are preying on our Indigenous persons, and very few people know how big this problem is because they receive little to no media attention. So we just started talking about them in the past couple of years. You might have heard that there is an Indigenous persons problem, like a missing persons problem with Indigenous people. And that may be the most that you've heard. But we really need the media, and we need to be talking about this problem so we can get the funds and the resources, that we can understand what's going on, and we can help intervene on this. So one thing that we're doing is exploring how Indigenous persons, if at all, they're talked about in the news when they go missing, and how that's different from non-Indigenous persons. We are also trying to get at user motivations, right? So like, we are looking at bias in ways that aren't directly asking people about their experiences. So one thing that we want to do is create a survey and engage with users on social media realms, so Facebook and everything else. What choices are they making, or what thoughts are they having when they click like and share? Right? What's going on in their minds at the individual level that increases or decreases the likelihood that they engage with that post. Another thing that we want to do is look at all the new social medias, right? So we know that Twitter is really important, Instagram, TikTok, but we haven't exactly figured out how to do all of those social media studies. So one thing we want to look at is, how is it functioning in other social media realms? And then also, how is it functioning cross-culturally in other countries, right? We do see missing white woman syndrome present in Canada, for example, with their Indigenous persons. They're typically treated in the news in the same way as our Indigenous persons here, or individuals of color here in the United States. But that's still worthy of some more exploration of what is it about those cultures that tend to push that missing white woman syndrome more than other cultures. So that's basically what I have going on, and welcome to answer any questions you might have, or provide some more clarity, or repeat what I said slower, because I'm a fast talker. Thank you.
Dr. Jeanis, thank you so very much for your presentation. Certainly, as you were presenting, one of the things I thought about, certainly as a father and as a grandfather, but even in relationship to any family member, relates to how much grief this must be for people who are experiencing the loss of someone in their lives, and the lack of closure and the incompleteness that they experience from this. Thank you so much for your emphasis on those individuals who are missing and disenfranchised. Really, every life is so valuable, and certainly, I was even wondering today, about let's consider the situation related to Ukraine and Russia, and families and individuals who are missing loved ones and whatnot. It makes my heart bleed just to think about it. But certainly appreciate your efforts and your research and all that you've done in this domain. Do you have a sense for, I am a social media dinosaur. I've never tweeted, blogged. I've never been on Facebook for the most part, unless I've looked at a Facebook page that's created for me by the department, in essence. Historically, I just haven't had a ton of time, and certainly I probably am missing out on a lot. But what do you consider to be the most effective form of social media? For me, if it's not something on television, I don't know a whole lot about it. But can you elaborate on the various forms of social media and what might be the most effective social media outlet?
Sure. So that's a hard question to answer because it's all happening so fast, especially for the researcher. Like we are just analyzing Facebook and everybody's moved on from Facebook, right? Like TikTok is the new thing, and I refuse.
You mean
to
I can't
download
catch
the
up?
app.
I can't catch up even? I can't catch up by, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just forget
Pardon me.
Facebook, move on to the next one. But unfortunately, law enforcement's using Facebook. Like law enforcement is late to the game too. So they're just now starting to utilize social media, and they're predominantly using Facebook. So that's typically why my research is with Facebook, because law enforcement, that's the first thing that they think of when they hear social media. But again, I think we're already too late. I mean, people should probably be looking at TikTok. Next generation, please look at TikTok. I'm too old.
Well, gosh, when you talk about TikTok, I'm thinking about tic-tac-toe, when you Snapchat, I'm thinking about somebody who talks really fast, like Dr. Perkins. But thank you for sharing that. I'm always kidding around, but certainly you're talking about something very, very serious. We invite anyone, especially students, as Dr. Michael mentioned earlier, to ask any questions, but I know that we have some faculty members as well, so feel free to share your questions. Proceed.
We have a question on chat, if you wanted to take a look at that.
Sure. Sarah, oh my gosh, is there a singular case that interests you most? Jesus Christ, how do you answer that question? No, there are the cases that keep me up at night, So I do, like for funsies, I do a podcast where it's called Missing Magnolias, and we feature missing persons cases, typically local, but if people reach out to us, we'll feature them. And that makes you, it connects you to the humanness of it, right? Like Professor Bowman was talking about that prolonged missingness and what that's like. And when I talk to families of the missing, they say that it's the worst form of grief and trauma, because you don't get a break from it. Your brain is your worst enemy. You wake up and go to bed and you think, is my baby hungry? Are they crying for me? Where are they? Are they being tortured? Like you think of your brain imagines the worst, right? Like that's the idea about scary movies. You never show the monster because it ruins the fear. That's what's going on in their heads, is the worst possible scenarios, and they get no break from that. And so it's very hard for them to carry on with traditional life, right? Because of that, you're stuck, right? And when we ask people who have experienced that prolonged missingness of a family member and then found that family member's remains, what they say is that it's preferable to visit a grave than it is to worry that they're being tortured every day. So just to say, it's a terrible, terrible trauma. And then I do this thing where I talk to these families, and you get those stories of, and you get this human connection. And I think that's what we're sort of missing when we get caught up in all the true crime. We're missing the humanness of it, right? When we're focusing on that, the Ted Bundys, these, sexy, smart, exciting offenders, we're not focusing on those real experiences of those victims and those families and those communities. And I think there's a lot of value in connecting to those stories when we can handle connecting to those stories. So I encourage us to listen to the stories and to the cases of where we hear about the victims. Like one of my favorite documentaries is Bayou Blue, which features the victims of Ronald Dominique, the serial killer who killed over 20 young Black and white men in Houma, Louisiana, and in New Orleans as well. Almost no one knows about that offender. And this is a beautiful documentary about the families, and you get to see, what it's like to try to recover from that redemption and all that kind of stuff. And I encourage us to do that kind of stuff that makes us uncomfortable, but touches our hearts, perhaps more than the cases that freak us out, right? Because I don't know, it separates us a little bit from the real problem, I think. That was a really long way to answer your question. Dr. Perkins.
Along the lines of, like where we could be better focused, do you have any opinion about, do you feel like that the media pays too much attention to the perpetrators in a way? Do you feel that can that be destructive? Yeah.
I absolutely think it can, especially when we talk about just singular perpetrators. When we spend all our time talking about Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, those are exceptions to the rules of offenders, even serial killers, right? We're not going to get another offender like that in our lifetime, but we spend so much time and effort and attention and money on these offenders that are not the average offender, right? Like your average serial killer is his blue collar and of average intelligence and not the super predator that you think he is. So when we focus on the offender, we're pulling away from what is actually the actual crime problem, which is, entertainment media is fine. Like I watched and listened to all the stuff too. I go to bed to Forensic Files. The voice is soothing. I get it. I'm part of it. But like we have to have the other side of it too, right? Which is the facts. And we have to make sure that we're not getting too caught up in the exciting story and losing sight of what's actually going on in our communities, right? We're like, our runaway kiddos, we're totally ignoring that problem, and that's happening in our community. So and also when we focus on the offender, we can contribute to victim blame, because we can say, we like to sit back and think of all of the ways that we would never let anything like that happen to us, right? And that's part of the thing that news outlets are doing, right? They'll bring in these faux experts that give you really vague tips on how to protect yourself. They'll be like, check the sex offender registry, right? That's a legitimate tip that I've heard an expert give on a news outlet related to a missing persons case. If you check the sex offender registry right now, there are hundreds of people on it. So what do you do with that information? Do you memorize all their faces and names? Are you going to create note cards so you can flash through and learn all of those sex offenders' faces so you can like watch out when you go outside? Like, no one can do that, right? You can't. Even if you tried your best, you wouldn't be able to function like that. So we're pulling away from the real stuff, right? And then we're more likely to say, oh, she, typically it's a she, deserved that because she didn't do all of these things that we've been told to do, right? She was out alone at night or whatever. When we focus on that offender and sensationalize him, then we tend to, on the other side of that, is talk about how dumb that victim is and then blame them. Makes us feel safer, but it's a false sense of security.
I remember seeing a documentary related to sexual victimization in the military. And one of the things that they showed, and it was that at one point, I don't think they do this now, but at one point, in order to address that problem, they started this program, I think it was called Buddy Up. And in the program, they actually would have like this role-played video of this scenario where this woman in the military was with some other people, and she went out at night on her own. And then there was this sort of like predator guy who was like trying to get her, and she was like ended up being rescued by some other nice guy, like showed up at the last minute, kind of ran him off, and then basically scolded her. Basically said, what are you doing? You have to buddy up. You have to be, which again, the message that was sent, that finally some people started to point that out, was the message was kind of, very close to explicitly saying it's your fault if you get assaulted. And, I think that it's hard to undo that sort of tendency for people to be blaming the victim and not even know that they're blaming the victim because it's so normalized.
Absolutely, yes. And I mean, we have a whole framing style dedicated to it. It's cautionary tale framing. A lot of our missing persons cases are framed in that way, where if we have a case where the offender is a man and the victim's a woman, and we can apply deviancy to her behavior before that victimization, that's the story that's featured, right? So we can tell people like, the world is dangerous, you will be victimized, and also tune in to learn more about ways you can protect yourself. And again, those tips will be vague.
I'm hearing a question from Dr. Brown. Dr. Brown, is there a question or comment that you have, please?
I didn't have a question. I was just kind of agreeing with the tendency to share information that's supposed to be helpful, but that ends up victim blaming. Like, years ago in like the early days of Facebook, I think I went off on a family member who was sharing all of these things like, don't wear overalls, don't wear your hair in a ponytail because someone, perpetrators can use this to grab you and subdue you. And I'm like, can we not share this kind of messaging that suggests that women have responsibility for how they appear in public to avoid being victimized? Can we just talk about not harming people instead? So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you. Is it Chrissy?
Yes, I don't really have a question, but I'm an international student from Switzerland, and I moved here a year ago, and I think it's crazy, like, because in Switzerland, of course we have missing people as well, but I never realized how big it is in the US and more like in Louisiana. And like my first few weeks, like sometimes I would just go out at night and just like go for a walk. And I told like some of my friends, and they're like, wow, you're crazy. Like, it's dangerous. Like, be careful. Don't go alone at night. Like, I was like, if I would do that in Switzerland, like, it's a very, very secure country, and like it's normal. And I feel like here it's like, yeah, you always have to be careful, and like, I don't know. So I just think that's crazy, just the difference between countries.
Absolutely. And that's why we need more research, cross-cultural research to really understand how unique of an issue is this in America. It does seem some flavors of it being a sort of uniquely American experience to frame crime in this way.
Yeah.
Dr. McGivers, any comment, question from you there?
Well, sadly, I came in late, so I only heard the last few minutes. And I apologize for that, Michelle. I really wanted to get here sooner, but I had students in my office. But I do really agree that this victim blaming thing that we do is just horrible. And I'm with Dr. Brown on that one for sure. And also that there aren't good, there's not good information about how to protect yourself or how to respond if someone is trying to attack you, what kinds of things you can do. There's some information I think that's, okay, stab them with your keys is a good one. But then you have to carry your keys in your hand and your fist so you can do that. It's frustrating, I think, to be in a situation where there's always that latent vulnerability for just engaging in normal human behavior. And I know that it's hard for everyone to know that there are these people who have gone missing and have disappeared completely, and we don't know where they went, and you could be next. You know, it's a horrible thought. And I think especially hard for our young women here at the university. I think it's especially hard for them to be aware of that. It just is upsetting. I don't know if I have any answers, but I am disturbed. But then people can say that about me a lot, so.
Dr. Perkins.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Dr. Jeanis, I'd like to ask you what kinds of thoughts you have about things that we can maybe as citizens look for to support in terms of public policy, in terms of laws. You know, are there things that are laws that have been passed and or revoked that you think are particularly relevant to this issue, that we might be a good thing for us to be educated on, so that we can see the connection between that and the issues that you're talking about here?
Ooh, good question. Thank you. So some states have been successful in passing legislation that requires every county, every law enforcement agency to submit their information to clearinghouses, so that we can get an idea of what the actual problem is. Louisiana does not have that legislature. So that was a push that we're all trying to do, is ensure that one day we have all of our statistics in the place that we need to be. So what's nice about uploading all of the missing persons cases on NamUs is that it's publicly available. Anyone can use it. Anyone can go and search today. So you can also submit your DNA. Family members can create cases or upload their loved ones' cases on the website. And what I didn't talk about is there's a whole world of armchair detectives who are doing really amazing stuff right now, especially with cold cases and unidentified remains. So there are people who in their spare time on a volunteer basis work to try and match cases and let law enforcement agencies know. So they'll scour the internet for missing persons cases in their state, and then they'll go to NamUs and they'll look at unidentified remains and they'll try and match. And if they can't find any matches in their state, then they're moving to the next nearest state and they're trying to match the characteristics of that unidentified remains with an active missing persons case. And then they're organizing all of that information and sending it to law enforcement agencies. So regular individuals like you and I are, when they get done with their 9 to 5, like doing this real work very seriously, because our own police aren't doing it. And those volunteers can't do that successfully if law enforcement isn't uploading those cases onto NamUs and our NCIC. So the biggest thing that we need is information sharing, right? We know that that's huge. I mean, that was the issue that we have with our inability to solve so many serial killer cases of the 80s, is that police agencies weren't talking to each other. Now we can, right? We have all of this information at our fingertips. Why aren't we using it? So if we could get the public caring about legislature that helps get those statistics where they need to be, I would think we would be moving in the right direction.
It seems to me that if we can get closer to having a system that works like on that show Criminal Minds, you know, they have like that one character, what's her name, Garcia, I think, where like they just like ask a question, she gets on her computer. Oh yeah, like, wouldn't it be great if that actually were true, right? If like everything was so integrated like that.
If even a fourth of that was true, we'd be solving cases. But I really think that forensic genetic genealogy, I can't stop talking about this. I really think that's going to give us so much insight onto our cold cases. Right now, your third cousin, we're catching our third cousins because of genetic genealogy. And what we're seeing is that who we're catching are people who were never on our radar. So people who were never arrested, never processed, often white individuals because they're less likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system. People who have been flying under the radar, we are now apprehending with forensic genetic genealogy. And I think it's going to change all of our statistics. I think we've probably been very wrong. We've only been catching the sort of not great criminals, right? Every once in a while we'll catch a mastermind. I mean, Ted Bundy wasn't even a mastermind, we just sort of happened to catch him. But you know what I mean? Like those people who have been really successful at avoiding detection are now being apprehended. And I think we should be paying attention to that too, as just consumers of our understanding of crime.
Dr. McIvers, you had
Yeah, I noticed in the chat, and I noticed that you mentioned that you had a podcast and that somebody wanted to watch your podcast. I might also like to do that. And I was wondering if you could give us the directions to your podcast.
Sure. It's called Missing Magnolias. And if you just give it a quick Google, it should show up in all of the things. And yeah, we're just trying to raise some awareness of some of those cases. You'll hear of a lot of local ones. We cover Kiosha Felix, Mickey Shunick, talk to some family members, that kind of stuff. So if you're curious about local cases, Katie Wise, then it's a good resource.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks so much. I cite 1155. Certainly very worthwhile time, great information, feedback. Thank you for making us more aware of this arena, and
Thank you.
appreciate you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, yes, yes. Our next talk again is 2:00. Is there any last quick question or a comment from anyone or anything else, Dr. Jeanis, that you'd like to share with us as we proceed to?
You can reach me. Let me shamelessly plug my research labs. Bruce at UL. All of those exciting studies are currently under data collection right now, and we're always soliciting new people who want to take part in that. I'm also the graduate coordinator of the Criminal Justice Department. If any of you are interested, let me lure you to the dark side.
Thank you very much for that. Appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
God bless you. Good to see you.
Good to see y'all. Bye. Thank you.
All righty. Bye-bye.